giant woman mocked by the town's men, until a lone rancher sat beside her. Margaret Hale sat alone at the edge of the market square, shoulders squared beneath a plain wool dress that fit her frame for work rather than comfort. And though the bench beside her was long enough for 3 people, no one chose it. Conversations shifted when she stood, boots scraped slightly farther away when she moved, and a pair of men who had nearly taken the seat glanced at her once before deciding the ground was preferable. She did not look at them. She simply occupied space the way she always had, fully and without apology. A wagon rattled past, dust rising briefly between stalls, and in that opening Elias Brooks crossed the square and sat down beside her without asking permission or scanning the crowd for approval. The bench creaked under the added weight, steady but audible. A man near the feed sacks stood abruptly and said loud enough for others to hear, "Bench strong, is it? Best hope so." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter followed. Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not anger, not embarrassment, just acknowledgement of what had been said. Elias did not turn towards the man. He adjusted his hat slightly and replied evenly, "It's held better men than you." The laughter stopped. The square went quieter than before. Margaret glanced at him briefly, measuring whether the remark was bravado or calm. It was calm. "Morning," he said, as if nothing had happened. "Morning," she answered. He studied the square ahead rather than her height. "I need help," he said plainly. That caught more ears than the insult had. Margaret blinked once. "With what?" "A barn beam," he replied. "Too heavy for one man. Too stubborn for rope." The man who had spoken earlier muttered something under his breath, but he did not sit back down. Margaret stood to her full height, her shadow stretching long across the dirt. For a second she looked at Elias. Not to test him, but to see if he would flinch. He didn't move. "Lead the way," she said. And this time, when she followed him through the square, the watching wasn't mockery. It was curiosity. Elias pushed open the barn doors and stepped inside without apology for the sagging timber overhead, and Margaret followed, her eyes lifting immediately to the main support beam that bowed slightly across the rafters, like something tired of carrying weight alone. Sunlight cut through cracks in the boards, illuminating dust that hung in still air beneath the strain. "Split near the joint," Elias said, setting down a coil of rope that had clearly failed its task. "Didn't notice until it leaned." Margaret stepped beneath the beam and pressed her palm flat against the wood, testing grain and tension the way others tested weather. "You braced it wrong," she said evenly. Elias nodded. "That's why I asked." Outside, 2 ranch hands slowed their horses near the fence line, pretending to adjust reins while watching through the open doors. Margaret positioned herself under the sagging timber, feet planted carefully. "When I lift," she said, "reset the brace straight." Elias moved into place with hammer ready. "On your word." She inhaled once and drove upward with controlled force. The beam rose, then a sharp crack echoed through the barn as one end shifted unexpectedly, splinters dropping from the seam. Outside, one of the watching men laughed loudly. "Told you it had split." The beam dipped again, weight uneven. Margaret did not curse. She stepped back, rolled her shoulders once, and reset her stance with wider footing. Elias didn't rush her. He simply said, calm and steady. Again. She met his eyes for a brief second, checking for doubt. There was none. She bent slightly and lifted a second time, slower now, distributing weight evenly through her frame instead of forcing height. The timber groaned but rose cleanly. Elias worked quickly, sliding the corrected support flush against the joint and driving nails with sharp, precise blows. "Hold," he said once. She held. Outside, the laughter had stopped. "Set," Elias called. Margaret eased the pressure down gradually, transferring the load onto the new brace. The beam settled into place, straight and secure. Dust fell, but nothing else moved. Silence filled the barn. Elias stepped back and studied the line overhead. "Steady," he said quietly. Margaret flexed her fingers once. "Wood listens if you don't rush it." The ranch hands mounted again without comment. As they rode off, they did not laugh. Margaret was rinsing sawdust from her hands at the trough when the sharp bawling cut across the yard, frantic and uneven, and Elias was already moving toward the lower pasture before explaining. "Fence line," he called back. She followed without hesitation. The small black calf had wedged itself between two warped rails near the ditch, one hind leg twisted badly, eyes rolling white as it kicked against splintered wood. Two town boys stood too close, shouting useless instructions at each other. "Step back," Elias warned, kneeling near the calf's head. The animal jerked violently at the sound, its hoof striking one of the boys square in the thigh and knocking him backward into the dirt. The second boy stumbled trying to help and slipped near the struggling leg. The calf thrashed again, panic rising. Margaret moved fast but without chaos. She stepped directly between the boys and the flailing hooves, turning her back toward the impact zone and lowering her body slightly to shield them. A hoof struck her hip hard enough to thud against bone, but she didn't flinch. "Stay still," she told the boys calmly. Her voice carried no fear, only command. Elias steadied the calf's head, speaking low and even, while Margaret placed one broad hand along the animal's neck, fingers firm but controlled. "Easy," she murmured. The calf continued to tremble, but the frantic kicks slowed slightly under the steady pressure of her touch. She studied the warped rails quickly. "You widen the gap," Elias said quietly. "I hold." She nodded once. The boys watched from behind her, breathing unevenly. Margaret wrapped both hands around the split rail and pulled outward slowly, distributing force evenly instead of wrenching it free. The wood creaked. The calf jerked again, nearly catching her shoulder, but she absorbed the movement without stepping away. "Now," she said. Elias guided the calf backward carefully, and with one final controlled pull, the animal slipped free and stumbled onto uninjured ground. It stood shaking for a second, then, unexpectedly, pressed itself against Margaret's side as if seeking cover. The boys stared. "It went to her," one whispered. Margaret rested her hand along its flank until its breathing eased. She finally stepped aside, giving it room to rejoin the herd. Elias rose slowly, brushing dirt from his sleeve. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded once. "I've been kicked harder by doors." The boys looked at her differently now, not at her height, but at the place where she had stood when it mattered. She had just finished resetting a loose hinge when the wind shifted hard enough to rattle the lower pasture gate, and Elias looked up from the tool crate at the exact moment the latch snapped loose with a sharp, metallic crack. "Gate!" he shouted, already running, but the next gust hit before he reached it, swinging the heavy wood panel wide and sending a ripple of unease through the nearby cattle. One cow bolted first, testing the open line, then another pressed behind it. Margaret moved without waiting for instruction. She reached the gate at the same moment Elias lunged for the dropped latch pin buried in the mud. The wind shoved the panel backward violently, and she planted both boots deep into the softened ground, gripping the top rail with both hands as the force tried to wrench it free again. "Hold it!" Elias called, fingers searching frantically through the dirt. The cattle surged closer now, low, restless sounds rising as the opening widened. One heifer broke through the partial gap, and veered toward the yard, triggering a sudden shift in the herd. Elias pivoted instinctively to intercept, but slipped on the wet grass, nearly going down beneath the hooves. Margaret released one hand from the gate, just long enough to grab the back of his coat and steady him upright before shoving the panel closed again with her shoulder. "Get the latch," she commanded. He recovered quickly, diving for the metal pin and forcing it back into place while she absorbed another brutal gust that sent the gate slamming against her frame. The cattle hesitated, confused by the sudden resistance, and Elias jammed the pin through the hinge loop just as another cow attempted to push forward. "Set!" he shouted. Margaret leaned her full weight forward one last time while he secured the bar. The gate slammed into place with a heavy thud, wood vibrating under impact before settling. The cattle slowly drifted back, agitation dissolving as quickly as it had formed. Elias stood, breathing hard. Mud streaked along his sleeve where he had nearly fallen. He glanced at her hands, red marks forming where the wood had scraped. "You could have let them run," he said quietly. "And chased them half the night?" she replied. He gave a short breath that was almost a laugh. "You grabbed me," he added. She adjusted her grip on the now secured latch. "You were about to lose footing." The wind eased gradually, but the moment had shifted something clearer than before. Not just strength beside him, but strength that moved with him. Margaret stood near the edge of the social hall as lanterns flickered against freshly swept wooden floors, the music already warming the room while conversations tightened into familiar circles. And though she had come to help arrange tables, she remained near the doorway, where shadow offered distance without retreat. Laughter rose near the punch bowl when someone mentioned the gate incident, voices low but audible. "Strong enough to break it," one man muttered. Another replied louder than necessary. "Hope the floor holds tonight." A few chuckles followed, uneasy but present. Margaret did not turn toward them. Her shoulders remained squared, hands folded loosely at her waist. She had heard worse. Elias entered shortly after, dust still along his boots, greeting a few neighbors with calm nods before scanning the room and spotting her immediately. He walked straight toward her without altering pace. The whispering thinned, but did not disappear. "Evening," he said. "Evening?" He glanced once toward the dance floor where couples had begun lining up. "They're short a pair." Margaret followed his gaze but said nothing. Behind them, the same voice spoke again, louder now. "She'll crack the boards." Silence fell sharper than the comment. Margaret's jaw tightened briefly. Micro-tension contained. Elias turned slightly, not to the speaker but to the room, and said evenly, "Then I'll stand where she stands." No anger, no raised tone, just certainty. The quiet that followed was heavier than laughter had been. He extended his hand toward her, steady and unforced. "Will you dance?" he asked. Margaret studied him, not the hand, not the floor, but his posture. He wasn't challenging the room. He wasn't rescuing her. He was asking. The room waited. For a moment, habit pulled at her, the instinct to step aside, to refuse spectacle. Then she placed her hand in his. "Lead properly," she said evenly. "Always," he replied. They stepped into the lantern light together. The boards did not creak beyond their ordinary protest. The music resumed, cautious at first, then fuller, and though eyes followed them, it was no longer mockery driving the silence. It was recalibration. Elias guided Margaret into the first turn without flourish, his hand steady at her waist, and his grip firm but measured. And for the first few steps, the room moved cautiously around them, as if expecting something to break. Not the boards, but the rhythm. Margaret matched him easily, her movements grounded and deliberate, boots landing cleanly against the polished wood. The first spin passed without incident, then the second. A few conversations resumed at the edges of the hall. Then, during the third turn, a shoulder struck her from the side, too sharp to be accidental. One of the men who had laughed earlier pivoted hard through the line, bumping her hip deliberately as he crossed. The contact jolted her balance for a split second. A murmur ran through the dancers. Margaret's boot slid half an inch on the floor, but she did not stumble. Instead, she shifted her weight smoothly, tightened her core, and regained full posture before Elias even had time to react. His hand steadied at her waist, not pulling, not panicked, just present. The man who had bumped her continued dancing as if nothing had happened, though his jaw tightened slightly when she did not falter. "Still steady?" Elias asked quietly. "Always," she replied. The next pass through the line came faster, the music gaining confidence, and Margaret followed the rhythm cleanly, her steps precise, her turns controlled. The boards did not protest. The hall did not crack. When the caller shouted for partners to cross and spin, Elias led her into the center again without hesitation. This time, no one interfered. A child near the edge clapped in excitement when she completed the turn smoothly, and a few of the older women exchanged thoughtful glances instead of skeptical ones. By the time the song ended, the tension that had hung over the floor had dissolved into something quieter. Respect not loudly declared, but undeniably present. Elias released her hand at the final note, but he did not step back immediately. "You don't move unless you mean to," he said softly. Margaret lifted her chin slightly. "Neither do you." The applause that followed was no longer cautious. It was genuine, and it carried farther than the earlier laughter ever had. She was stacking empty cups near the refreshment table when she noticed the room had changed its posture around her. Conversations no longer stalled when she approached, and space was offered without hesitation instead of avoidance. Across the hall, Thomas Reed stood near the wall with two other men, arms folded, expression measured rather than amused. Elias joined them briefly, speaking low. Margaret did not strain to hear, but she saw Thomas glance toward her, then back at Elias. After a moment, Thomas cleared his throat and said, not loudly but clearly enough for those nearby to hear, "Didn't expect her to handle that gate the way she did." It wasn't apology, it wasn't praise, but it wasn't mockery either. The men beside him nodded slowly. Elias responded evenly, "She doesn't handle things halfway." Thomas's jaw shifted slightly, pride wrestling with concession. "Suppose not," he said. The exchange was brief, but the room felt it. Margaret continued her task without reacting, though she had heard enough. A young woman approached hesitantly. "Miss Hale," she said carefully, "would you help us move the long table? It sticks near the wall." The request was ordinary, direct. Margaret nodded once and walked with her toward the table. She lifted one end smoothly while the others guided the legs free of the warped plank beneath it. No spectacle, no gasps, just cooperation. When the table settled evenly, Mrs. Dalton smiled faintly and said, "Thank you." Not distant, not cautious, simply polite. Thomas watched from across the room, expression unreadable, but he did not look away when Margaret straightened. Instead, he tipped his head once in acknowledgement before turning back to his drink. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it marked movement. Elias stepped beside Margaret again near the doorway as the next song began. "That's about as close to praise as he gets," he said quietly. Margaret exhaled once. "I didn't need praise," she replied. "You got recognition?" Elias said. She glanced toward Thomas briefly, then back at the dance floor where couples were already forming lines without hesitation this time. "Recognition's heavier," she said evenly. Elias nodded once. "It carries longer." And for the first time since she'd walked into the hall, Margaret no longer felt like the largest presence in the room, only part of it. Margaret stepped outside the hall for air once the music swelled too warm against the lantern-lit walls, and Elias followed a moment later without haste, stopping beside her at the porch rail, where night settled quiet and clear beyond the noise of the room. The stars were sharp above the dark pasture, the fence line visible in pale moonlight where it stretched steady across the land. For a few breaths, neither of them spoke. "You don't have to prove anything anymore," Elias said gently. Margaret leaned her forearms against the railing. "I wasn't proving," she replied. "I was choosing." He considered that. "Does it ever bother you?" he asked carefully. "The way they used to look at you?" She did not answer right away. Inside the hall, laughter rose, softer now, unstrained. "It used to," she said finally. "Not because they feared me, because they decided who I was without asking." He nodded once. "And tonight?" She turned slightly toward him, her expression steady but not guarded. "You're the first man who didn't look away," she said quietly. The admission hung between them, not dramatic, not fragile, just honest. Elias held her gaze without flinching. "I didn't see a reason to," he replied. The simplicity of it carried more weight than reassurance ever could. She studied him for a long moment, searching for exaggeration or vanity, and finding neither. "Most men shrink when they stand beside me," she said. "Most men measure wrong," he answered lightly. A faint breath of laughter left her, small, genuine. The night air cooled between them, comfortable rather than tense. "You asked me to dance like it was ordinary," she said. "It was," he replied. "You asked me to lift a beam like it was necessary," she countered. "It was," he repeated. Silence returned, but now it felt deliberate, chosen. "You staying?" he asked after a moment. Not possessive, not demanding. Margaret looked toward the hall, where the town had finally begun to move around her instead of away from her. "I'm not leaving a place that finally looks me in the eye," she said evenly. Elias nodded once, not triumphant, just understanding. When they walked back inside together, no one paused to stare. They simply made space. She was tightening a loose plank along Elias's outer fence when 3 town boys approached hesitantly from the road, hats in hand, boots scuffing dust instead of kicking it this time. Elias stood a few paces back, repairing a hinge, watching without interfering. The boys stopped near the post where the gate had nearly failed, days earlier. "Miss Hale?" the oldest began carefully. Margaret straightened to her full height, but softened her posture, waiting. The boy swallowed once. "Will you show me?" She tilted her head slightly. "Show you what?" "How you held it," he said, gesturing toward the gate. "When it almost broke." The request wasn't a dare. It wasn't mockery. It was instruction sought. Margaret studied their faces, nervous but sincere. She nodded once and crouched beside the hinge. "Strength isn't about pushing harder," she said calmly. "It's about knowing where to stand." She placed the boy's hands along the rail, adjusting his grip. "Feet wide, weight low. Let the wind hit you and don't fight it straight on." The younger boy mimicked the stance awkwardly. "Like this?" he asked. "Almost," she replied, shifting his footing slightly. Elias stepped closer now, resting his tools on the fence. "She listens to the pressure first," he added, "then moves." The boys glanced between them, absorbing the lesson as if it were more than wood and metal being discussed. Margaret gave the gate a firm shove to test their stance. The boys held, not perfectly, but better than expected. "Good," she said. A wagon passed on the distant road, and the driver slowed just long enough to see the lesson unfolding before continuing without comment. The boys finally stepped back, grinning sheepishly. "Thank you," the oldest said. Not rushed, not embarrassed. When they walked back toward town, they did not hurry. They did not look over their shoulders. Margaret remained crouched for a moment longer, brushing dirt from her palms. "That's new," Elias said quietly. "Being asked?" she replied. He nodded. "It suits you." She stood and looked along the fence line they had repaired together, the pasture calm beyond it. "It's lighter," she admitted. Elias studied her profile in the fading light. "You staying?" he asked again, softer this time. She met his gaze without hesitation. "I am." And the word carried less weight than fear ever had. Margaret stood beside the same bench in the market square a week later, not sitting yet, simply resting one hand along its worn edge while morning light stretched across the storefronts. And this time the space beside her did not remain empty for long. Elias crossed the square with the same unhurried stride he had that first morning and sat down without hesitation, dust rising softly around his boots. A few townsfolk glanced over, but no one laughed. No one moved away. The bench creaked once under the shared weight and held steady. Margaret lowered herself beside him. For a moment, neither spoke. The square carried its usual rhythm now. Wagons, greetings, ordinary business. "You didn't move from that bench," she said quietly. Elias turned slightly toward her. "Neither did you." The words settled with more weight than they appeared to carry. She looked ahead at the storefront where whispers once started, then faded before forming. "They were waiting for it to break," she said. "The bench?" he asked lightly. "The moment." He nodded once. "Strong things don't break because someone expects them to." She studied him briefly. "You weren't proving anything that day." "No," he replied. "I was sitting where I meant to sit." A small smile touched her expression. Not guarded, not restrained. The square felt different now, not because she had shrunk to fit it, but because it had expanded to include her. A child ran past and nearly tripped over Elias's boot before righting himself. Margaret instinctively steadied him with one broad hand before releasing him again. The boy grinned and continued on without fear. Elias watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. "You're not feared anymore," he said. Margaret's gaze remained forward. "I never needed fear." He extended his hand between them, not dramatic, not claiming, just open. She looked at it only briefly before placing her own into his, fingers strong and certain. He didn't tighten his grip beyond what was necessary. The bench held, the square moved, and when they rose together to walk toward the ranch road, their shadows stretched side by side across the dirt. Different shapes, same direction, proof that nothing about her had needed to shrink for the town to finally stand steady. Would you have sat beside her that morning? Or would you have walked past like everyone else? Be honest. If you enjoy powerful frontier stories about dignity, quiet strength, and unexpected partnerships, subscribe for more Western tales.